Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Syntax, and today we're going to be building a local first application. Now, this is going to be based on an invoice application that I wrote that works entirely offline. This works with local data stored in an IndexedDB. It works completely offline with a service worker, and it even lets you export your data. Now, since there's no data going to a server anywhere, this thing is extremely fast. It loads all of your invoices directly from your own computer, so that data, again, is private. It is on your computer, and it doesn't need to make a network request to get it. Now, I'll show you a quick demo here where we can have all of our different invoices. These are stored inside of, like I mentioned, an IndexedDB. Anytime we make an adjustment to this, if I refresh, you'll see this happens automatically. It saves it completely for us. So this thing auto saves as well, and we can even export all of our invoices as JSON. Now, over the course of building this, we're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of what it takes to build an application like this using minimal dependencies. We're just going to be using one, which is called Dexie. It is an IndexedDB wrapper that just makes working with IndexedDB, the local database in your browser, a little bit easier. Other than that, we will be building this in Svelte Kit, but that is not going to be that important because I will call out anytime anything is different in React, Vue, etc. And if you know React, if you know Vue, you can still follow along to this because the framework is not really what's important here. It's how we work with the data and how we work with the form. And through that, we'll have a real working app by the end of this, although it's not going to be this pretty. This source code is completely open source if you ever want to take a look at this and potentially skip the rest of this video. So let's get going. Like I mentioned, we're going to be starting with a Svelte Kit application. So from my terminal, I'm going to create a new Svelte Kit project. You can do that with npm create svelte at latest, and then we can give this a name. We can call this local invoice, okay? This is the name. Now, again, don't feel like you have to use Svelte Kit for this. It might even help if you follow along in your own framework of choice, because over the course of this video, what we'll be doing is we'll be diving into even some of the browser utilities that help you understand what's going on here. So this is more than just building a thing in Svelte. This is about core features. Okay, so the way we do this is I'm going to say this is going to be a skeleton project for scaffolding, and then we're going to say yes to TypeScript, ESLint prettier, and I will select the Svelte 5 preview. If you're not familiar with Svelte 5 or you don't care, again, you can use Svelte 4 and follow along just as easily. Okay. So from there, we're going to change directories into our local invoice. I'm going to run code on this just to get this up in VS Code. I'm going to be using VS Code to work on this. So if you notice, I'm going to be using what is called the Level Up Official theme for this inside of VS Code. You can use any text editor you'd like. That doesn't matter. Okay, let's run npm install. And before we get anything else going, I'm actually going to add a package, and this is going to be Dexie. Like I mentioned, this is going to be the only package we add in this. So we'll say npm install --save Dexie, D-E-X-I-E. This is a really commonly used utility, so don't feel like you're installing some random plugin. This thing is definitely battle tested. Now from here we can run npm run dev. Since this is a Vite site, this is just going to pop open in our 5137 port like you might be used to. All right, here we are. Now for a lot of this video, I'm going to keep this open side by side, but we'll do a lot of tabbing back and forth here like this. I'll make sure that the font size is nice and big for you. Again, I'm going to try to call out Svelte specific things. Now, the way that this works inside of a Svelte app is you just have your routes. Inside of your routes is your main route. Now, we're not going to have any routes in this application beyond just the index page, so I don't need to create any files. I'm just going to go ahead and clear out the contents of this file. Now, the first couple of things we'll want to do before we get into anything is we're going to create a couple of files. One will be our db.ts for our database creation, and the other is going to be our data.ts, which will include like the initial state for our application. And we can create those side by side in our routes folder. Simply creating a file in our routes folder isn't going to cause any issues. So we can say db.ts and then another one, which is data.ts, like I mentioned. And db.ts is going to be where we're going to start. The first thing we're going to want to do is create our database. So that way we have access to add and store and remove things, right? So we'll want to import Dexie from Dexie, there we go. And we'll eventually be importing some types and stuff, but we'll also be doing that with auto imports. I'll show you how we do that. So the first thing we're going to do is say const db is equal to new Dexie, and then Dexie is going to take a string, which will be our name of our database. So we can call this anything we want. We can say invoice local. And we don't need to do anything else there, but we will in a second once we want to add some TypeScript to this. Next thing we're going to do is to do db.version, and we're going to say the first version of this will have stores. And to define our stores here, we don't actually need to define any individual fields in our table. We first say, here's what our table is, and then here's what the indexes are, and here's what the primary key is. So we're going to have a table named invoices, and invoices is going to have a primary key, which was defined by ++, and we'll say ID, comma, and then anytime we need to search on something and load data, we'll want to have an index as well. The only other thing we're going to be doing on this is the date field in which we're going to be using. Okay, now from here we can say export db. That's it. That's how we create our database using Dexie here. We'll come back to this in a second so that way we get full TypeScript support on this, but let's head to our data. Now, I mentioned that we're going to be building an application based on this invoice application. The invoice application is a lot of text fields, like a lot of text fields. And that's going to get confusing for you as we do this. So we're going to keep it to 2 fields, which is an invoice number and a name, okay, just a straight up name. And that's going to allow us to focus on the local first techniques. And then once you want to dive in deeper, you can take a look at the invoice application that I built. So we're going to say export const initial data, and that's going to be equal to an object. The object is going to have a single property of invoice, which is going to be an empty string, eventually a string of a number, and name. Like this. Okay, so that's our initial data. Now let's head back to our db.ts. That way we can use our initial data to inform the database what exactly the type of this thing is going to be. So we're going to do types in a couple of ways. So the first thing we're going to do is on our line 3 where we have our const db, we're going to say as Dexie ampersand, like this. And then we can define what we have in here. So we could say invoices. Now invoices is going to use a generic type, entity table. Did I spell entity right? Yes, I did. Entity table. We can hover over this or select it with our mouse and do command period. And it's going to open up this quick fix where you can say update import from Dexie. Otherwise, you can always just type entity table in our import as well. Now this is going to take a couple of parameters, one of which is going to be the primary key and another of which is going to be the shape of the data. So let's define that shape of the data. I'm going to export an interface invoice, okay, like so. And this is going to have an ID property, which is going to be a number. And I have this as optionally undefined, a date, which is a string, and a form data, which is the type of initial data. Now, once again, let's select this and do a command period and import from the data. You'll see this is import type initial data from data. And we can say, hey, the form data is going to be in the shape of the initial data. And likewise, what we can do is now say in our entity table generic, we can say it will be the type of invoice with the primary key of a string of ID. And just like that, our database is going to now have knowledge about what the shape of our data will be the entire time. Okay, I'll linger on this. You can pause it here if you'd like. All right, and same with this. Because now it's time for the fun stuff. We're going to start building our application, and we're going to first do so where we get this data storing and saving into a database. Then we're going to be able to load the data from the database. Then we're going to set up automatic syncing. Then we're going to set up the export stuff and the service worker. Sound good? Let's get going. Okay, so now let's get to the fun stuff. The first thing I'm going to do here is add a script tag inside of our page.svelte. This is just the main route. I'm going to make sure this has a lang.ts on here. That's going to make sure that we get TypeScript support in the file. If you're a React fan, this could be considered the body of your function for the component, right? This is where we do the stuff inside of the component. Now, I'm going to be adding some state here, and we're going to be using Svelte 5. Now, I'm going to call out the things that make Svelte 5's state different, so you can follow along with your use state in React. The first thing we want to do is bring in our form data and have it be set to the initial data we created. Now, form data is going to be equal to state, and that state is going to be initial data. Now the initial data hasn't been imported, so if we have it selected, we can always do command period, add import, or just type that import ourselves. Now one thing to know about this, since we're using an object for our initial data, this goes for any front-end framework, React, Svelte, whatever. If you set this data into state and you modify that object, it's actually going to be modifying the object reference. So if you modify the state, it's going to be modifying the initial data object, which causes problems down the line. So we're going to be running a structured clone on this thing. Structured clone is a function that's built into the browser and the node, and it allows you to create a clone. Now, if you need support going back before, 2022 or something, you'll want to use something that is a little bit more robust. For this application, not too worried about using structured clone here. You can always bring in a structured clone library if you'd like for that more deep support. Now we're also going to be setting a status, and status is going to be set to loading. Now I like using a status variable here for our state instead of like a is loading state. I think it just works quite a bit better. We can say loading or ready for our potential types. That way we don't try to do operations while the data is still being loaded. Next, I'm going to also have one more here, which is going to be let loaded ID, which is going to be equal to, the type is going to be either a number or undefined, and I'll even throw null in here since we'll have a default of null, and this is going to be equal to state of null. Now in Svelte, this $state is very similar to the use state. The only difference is it doesn't spit out a function and the state. It just spits out the state and you mutate the state directly. It's all done through proxies, where React you do use state and have the function to update your state. Okay, so that's going to be the small caveat and the difference between how we approach state in React versus Svelte here. Okay, so let's come down and let's write our HTML now to at least get this started. I'm going to have a section here. Inside of our section will be an H1 that just says invoice. I'm then going to have a div for each row of the form, as well as a div to encapsulate them. Inside of the first form row is going to be a label, and this is going to be for invoice, and the label name is going to be invoice number. From here, we're going to have an input type of text, and it's going to be an ID of invoice. And this is where a little bit of the Svelte magic comes in. We're going to bind the value. So bind value form data.invoice takes that form data state that we have, and it's going to automatically update that state anytime this changes. React folks have to have an onChange function to update the state or use a form library of your choosing. Okay, we can copy and duplicate this row. I did that by selecting it and hitting Shift Option and hitting the down key in case you've never done that. I'm going to have name, 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 and then bind value, name. Just change all the words invoice to name. Okay, pretty simple. Now, the last thing we're going to want to do here is have a section up top here for some controls. I'm going to have a button that is just save, because we're really getting to the point where we can start interacting with this thing now. In fact, if we head to our invoice, you can see it looks like this. We can obviously type in here, Scott, there we go. Works, right? Nothing crazy. So let's get into actually saving this into our database, which is really why we're here, right? So we're going to have an async function, and this is save, async function, save. This save function will undergo some changes, so it's going to be a little primitive right now. But the first thing we're going to want to do in our save function is we're going to say const new invoice ID is going to be equal to await db.invoices.add, like this. Now, the first property we're going to add on here, remember that we needed a date field. That date field is going to be equal to a new date.toISO string. And then the next one is going to be form data. Now, you might be wondering why we're not getting auto-completion here. That's because I didn't import the DB yet. If we have this selected, we can always do command period import DB, like this. And here, you can see that TypeScript is saving us because I wrote data instead of date. That's classically the type of thing I would do. Now, we're obviously going to be wanting to pass the form state into this method here, the add method, but this is a Svelte specific thing, folks. React, you can just pass in the forms data. With Svelte, because the state is a proxy, we need to do this fancy $state.snapshot, which will grab a snapshot of the state at that second instead of using the proxy. So we're going to get the snapshot of our state form data and save into the database. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the loaded ID is going to be equal to our new invoice ID, like this. Nice. Next, we can add the on click and call save on click. Now we now have a form that can work in our local DB and save this data. So for instance, if I say, like this, and before I click save on this, let's head to our DevTools. We're going to be spending a lot of time in the application tab of the DevTools. You'll see that we have our IndexedDB here, and none of them are the ones that we named. So when we click save here, fingers crossed, this gets saved to our database. And just like that, you can see we do have an invoice local, and inside of here, you can see the information we saved, including all of the form data. That's pretty amazing, right? That's super amazing. But I refreshed the page and it's gone. Let's in fact add another one just for fun. I'm going to say name is Wes. You can see it says our data is stale. We can click the refresh here, and now all of our data is here. Okay, so we're now able to store in our local DB. That's great. What's next? Well, we want to be able to load any individual invoice we have. To do that, we want to first load all of the invoices from the data, put them in a select list, and then we're going to be able to toggle that select list to choose which one we're loading, okay? It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be super easy. So let's go ahead. The first thing we're going to do is create one more state variable. This will be the last one, and this will be all invoices is equal to an empty array. The type of this is going to be the invoice type that we made earlier on. We can import that. There we go. Type invoice. And it's going to be an array of those. So that's all invoices here. Next thing we want to do is create a function to async function load all invoices. And this is going to be a really simple function. All invoices is equal to await db dot, and again, this is where we get this awesome TypeScript help, invoices dot, and this time we're going to do order them by the date, dot to array. That way we get them in an array, pop them into our all invoices state. Next thing we want to do is write an effect. So that way this load all invoices runs when the component mounts, okay? So we can do $effect like this and load all invoices. Now, React folks, this is the exact same as a use effect with an empty dependency array. That's it. So if you do use effect, empty dependency array, load all invoices, that's the same, right? Cool. So this is going to run now every single time our component mounts, and that's great. We'll also want it to run every single time we add a new or save an invoice to our into our database. Okay, cool. Cool. Let's go ahead and now write the select list that shows all of our invoice numbers. I'm going to do so in our controls area, and in fact, this is going to get a little crowded, but some of this stuff will be removed eventually. So we'll say select. The name is going to be all invoices. ID is going to be all invoices. And we're going to do an each loop here. So we're going to say each of the all invoices as invoice is going to be an option with a value of the individual ID, and the date is going to be what's displayed in the select list. Okay, if we come here, we can now see that select list of all of the invoices we have created. Toggling them does nothing. So let's go ahead and add event here. We're going to say on change, and on change, what we're going to want to do is load invoice. Okay, load invoice is a function that does not exist. So let's write it. This is going to be how we load a single invoice, function load invoice from the select event. Okay. What we're going to want to be doing is using the actual event from the select list, so we can target the const select is equal to event.target as an HTML select. We're also going to want to say the const ID is equal to, and the first thing we're going to do is check to see if select.value exists. It should exist, but doesn't hurt to check. We're going to say parse int selected value or none. So if the selected value exists, parse it as an int or set it to null. That way we can do if ID is truthy, then what we'll want to do is get the selected invoice is going to be equal to await, and then we can grab the latest one dot get dot ID. Okay, now we'll check to see if selected invoice actually exists in the database, right? If it actually existed. What we're going to want to do is we're going to first set our form underscore data is equal to the selected dot form data, and I'll run through this again once we're done. Sorry, not selected, selected invoice. There we go. And then also the loaded ID is going to be equal to the selected invoice ID. Now to top this all off, let's go ahead and add our status. So before we do anything, we're going to set to loading, and then after we're done, we're going to set to status of ready. Now there's other states you could have, like an error state and stuff like that. This is going to be kind of naive, okay? So this is going to run every single time the select list has changed. It's going to look at the select list itself. It's going to grab the value. If that value exists, parse it as an integer. If that exists, grab it from the database. If the database record exists, update our state with the new data. So let's go ahead and change this. You can see Wes and Scott. Nice. It's now loading our state directly from IndexedDB, and it's instant. It's not even hit the network for this. Now, one addition to this that I want to make is that when we refresh, I want it to always load the most recent invoice. So we can create another async function load recent invoice. Now this is going to be a somewhat simple function as well, although we want the loading state in here. So we're going to say status is equal to loading first and foremost, and then we're going to do const most recent invoice is going to be equal to await db.invoices.order by, and we're going to order them by date and get the last one, get the most recent one. Okay, Copilot helped me out here. If most recent invoice actually exists, then set the form data to the most recent invoice.form data, loaded ID to the most recent invoice ID. Now, just like our load all invoices in the effect, we'll want this to run on mount. When we make that change, you can see it always loads the most recent one. However, one thing you'll notice is that the select list state is out of sync from what's actually loaded. So we'll want to set the initial value of the select list to be the loaded ID. Notice how we're not binding this value. We don't want it to update the value. We just want it to set the initial value. Okay, now when we use this thing, it's actually the correct one. Perfect. So good. Cool. Awesome. Okay, so this is really great. We now have the ability to load new invoices and load all of the invoices and select a new one. That's really amazing. But how do we create a new invoice now? Because you'll see here, we're kind of stuck in this trap. And if we were to click save actually one of these, what would happen? Well, check this out. In fact, if we click save on Scott, now we end up having 3 invoices, 2 of which are the exact same. So we'll want to adjust that functionality. So the next thing we're going to want to be doing here is we're going to be able to create a new invoice, update the invoices we have, get auto saving working, then get the export data and the offline stuff going. So a lot of stuff to do here, but you can already see the potential of working with this local data and how easy it can be. Okay, so let's get going on all of that. The first thing we'll want to have is a new invoice. So we can say new invoice, and this is actually, function new invoice. This is the first one that doesn't need to be an async function. And all we're going to do is simply set loaded ID to null. And the form data is going to be, once again, a structured clone of our initial data. And then we're going to want to have a button down here, button new invoice. This is going to have an on click of running the new invoice function. So now you'll see that any given time we click new invoice, it resets the form. I can put in my number here and I can say CJ and click save. From there, you can see I now have Scott, Wes, and CJ. I click new invoice. Let's do one more. Who cares? And we can say Caitlin and we can say save. Brilliant, right? It's now creating a new invoice every single time we tell it to, and each time it saves it, right now, it will actually create a new invoice if we save it. So let's go ahead and fix that in our save function. Now, the save function is going to be kind of what you imagine it to be, where we're going to check to see if the ID exists. In fact, if loaded ID exists, if we currently have one loaded, we don't want to create one. We want to update it. Otherwise, we'll want to go ahead here and create a new one and then run load all invoices. So loaded ID, if loaded ID exists already, we'll want to do a simple db.invoices.update, where we're going to pass in the loaded ID as the param. We're going to grab the data as a snapshot, and then the date, since this is going to be considered an updated at, is going to be named the new date ISO string. So just like if we were creating a new one, we'll update the date. So we're going to take a snapshot of the data just like we had if the loaded ID exists. Otherwise, we create a new one. So let's go ahead and change Caitlin's to 111222, click save, and hopefully it has not created a new one, which you can see it hasn't, and Caitlin's has been updated. Now this sets us up really nicely for the autosave functionality that we want to do. So let's get the auto-saving working. Now, auto-saving is going to be kind of interesting because we are going to be using a use effect inside of this, and the use effect is going to be a little bit different than how React does it, but I'll tell you about it. We're going to create another effect, and this effect is going to call our save function anytime there's been a modification to our state. So in React, you could think of this as if we had our state in the dependency array, then this function would run. So if our status is equal to ready, okay, so we want to make sure that it's not in the loading state before calling this. We're going to want to call save, and we're going to want to call save if the form data has changed. Now this gives us an opportunity to optimize here because we can do state.snapshot as well in here and snapshot our data at this point. That way we won't have to do it later. Now we get the squiggly because save is not looking for any sort of data. Okay, that's fine. We'll fix that in a second. But now what this is essentially saying is anytime form data has updated, run this function, and that function is save, just like we had with the button. And we'll take a form. Actually, let's just call this data like this, and it's going to be the type of form data. I'm sorry, type of initial data. There we go. There we go, type of initial data. And this data we're going to be using instead of state.snapshot form data. This is already the snapshot, so we can just replace both of those like that. And that's it, folks. Every single time we update this data inside of here, it's going to save. So you can see 333. I'm not going to have to click save. I'm going to go to another invoice, CJ's. I'm going to come back, and you can see that 333 has been updated. Again, I can say CJ is dope. I can come back to Caitlin, I can come back to CJ, and it maintains that. And likewise, if I refresh, CJ is dope has now been the most updated one, and therefore it is loading first. So anytime you make a modification just like that, there's no network request that you have to worry about, so you don't have to sit and wait for this stuff to happen. It just happens on save. That's incredible. This is really amazing, and we now have ourselves into a really nice state where this data is always being saved and synced locally. So what else is left to do, right? We've created invoices. They save automatically. We can load new ones. We can create new ones. What else do we have to do here? Well, we want to get ourselves working offline, and we want to be able to export the data as well. So let's first get the working offline working. Now, I will say this is going to be different no matter what platform you are working in. And even if you're working in Vite and other applications, this might be different. I'm going to be grabbing the default service worker directly from Svelte Kit's website. If you're using NextJS or you're using Vite in a different capacity, there's a PWA plugin. I know there's a lot of documentation on how to get a service worker working in the basic service worker, because that's all we really need right now. We just need the ability to run these files cached when we're not online. Now, this copy button is kind of broken on here, or at least it is for me, so I'm going to zoom out and just copy this entire service worker from the Svelte Kit docs. You can grab this on the kit.svelte.dev service worker if you're following along. And what we need to do is save this. In fact, let me grab the whole thing. I'm going to put it into a .js file, even though we're doing TS, just so I don't have to worry about our types. And I'm going to copy it like this. From here, I'm going to head into our source folder, and I'm going to create a new file, service-worker.js, paste this in here. And again, you'll want to find how to make a service worker or even a generic service worker for your application to get this up and running. Now, when I come back here, you can see it's already kind of doing something, because when I select service workers from my application, you can see that a service worker has been loaded. Okay. That's it. All this service worker is doing, and this might look mysterious to you, you can get in here. What it's essentially doing is it's finding all of the assets that your application normally has to download from the network or even from your local file system, and it's caching those individual files as individual paths. That way, when the network tab comes in and this stuff loads, in fact, let's turn off this disable cache first. So this, make sure this is not selected. Now, before we do anything else, you want to make sure that this says status active and running. If it's not, one thing you can try to do is hit unregister and refresh this page if you're not getting a full green light here, because that means that it, for whatever reason, sometimes multiple service workers can get installed on a specific URL. It's kind of a mess sometimes with service workers, but as long as we have this active and running right here, it's working. For that said, if we head to our network here and we now refresh, make sure your disabled cache has been turned off. What you want to see before this is working is down here in the size, you want to see it says service worker right here. Okay? If it says service worker right here, you know you're ready to go offline. We can change that by up top here where it says no throttling. We can select offline. We can now refresh and check it out. Our application works. Not only does it work, but it loads every bit of data that we wanted it to from the very start. You can modify anything. I don't even have to click save. In fact, we can remove that save button entirely now. And this whole thing works the exact same way it does offline as it does online. And if we turn the application back to online, nothing changes. The data is all being stored locally. Nothing is being hitting the network. The only thing the service worker is doing for us is saving the files that we would typically load from the, potentially from the network, but loading them from your browser's cache instead. It's incredible. So we now have this working offline. We have it saving automatically. Last step is to get this exporting data and we're good to go. Okay, so let's do that. And this is going to be easier than you might expect. Essentially what we're going to be doing here is creating a fictional button, and we're going to be creating a blob and then passing that blob into a click, so that way we can save this as JSON. I mean, we already have the data as a JavaScript object. Getting it into a JSON shouldn't be too tough. Actually, one thing I'm going to do before we do that is remove this save button entirely. That way we don't get it confused, considering it's non-functional anyways. Okay, let's get this going here. We're going to write a new function called export. And so this is going to be async export, async function export. Okay, like this. Now this function is going to be fun. We're going to throw this into a try catch, right? Just because. And I'll put an error in case there is one. Okay, so inside of this try catch, the very first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to grab the latest all invoices from our database, just so we get fresh data no matter what. So we'd say const all invoices export is equal to, let me remove that sidebar, and we can do DB invoices to array. Now I'm not worrying about the order in which they're coming out of here, but if you want to, you can. Next thing we're going to do is create a JSON string is going to be equal to JSON.stringify all invoices export. If you want this to look like actual JSON and be structured, you want to say comma null comma 2. This allows it to be indented by 2, so you'll get an indented file. Okay, next thing we'll want is a blob. That blob is going to be equal to a new blob. That new blob is going to take in an array where we have JSON string as the first parameter here, and then the type of it is going to be application.json. So we're creating a actual JSON file. Let me make this full screen so we can see it. Then we're going to create a URL for this using URL create object URL and pass in the blob. It seems like Copilot wants to do this for me, but we're going to do it together. Next, we're going to create a link, which is going to be a document.create element, and that's going to be an anchor. We're going to add the URL, the one that we created for the blob, to the link href. Then we're going to set link.download equal to invoices.json. That way it knows how to name this file. And also it'll initiate a download for this instead of linking to the file. Then we're going to document.body append child, link.click, document body remove child, and then simply URL revoke URL. So what are we doing? And actually, I noticed something stupid. I call this export. Let's call it something export data. Export's a reserved word in JavaScript. That's why we're getting those red underlines. Okay, so we're getting all the data. We're setting it to JSON. We're creating a blob out of that JSON. We're turning that into a URL. We're then creating a link for the DOM. We're setting the URL. We're making sure it downloads to a JSON file. Then we're appending that to the body. We're clicking it and then immediately removing it from the body and then nuking that URL from existence. Okay, that's it. So I'm going to head now and down here, we're going to create a new button called export. And this is going to be on click export data. This is the last thing we need to do, and then we're done. It's going to be pretty amazing here. So if we head to our browser and we click export, you'll see it seems like it worked. Okay, now before I conclude that it works, let's go ahead and load it up in VS Code and make sure that this works. So I have my invoices file, I'm going to open it up, and just like that, I have a valid JSON file with all of the data. Now you could see how this could work where you then write an import function that takes this JSON and loads it into your state and then saves it into the database. That wouldn't be too hard, and in fact, I want to issue you a challenge. I want to see what you can do with this. Can you build the rest of the invoice functionality out? In fact, you can take a look at mine if you want any helpers, or also, you can also choose to try to have the opportunity to write an importer function for this as well. Those are great ways to practice working with local data. Now, in further videos, what I'm going to be talking about in the local first world, here's some of the things that we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about using replicache to store not only data, but messages about how that data should be updated and synced on the back end. And then we're going to be writing a real backend server for that, where we can store things in a legitimate, real database and get control over that, how that data is syncing, what updates what, and versioning that data. So that way we can sync our data offline to a database that will always update what we're actually loading. So anytime you refresh or modify anything, you'll get fresh data when you come back online, and that way it's not all just local. Now, one last thing before we get going, there's an opportunity where your data can become, well, wrong, and the data in the database is now off from what you actually wanted to have. I want to show you just really quick. Anytime we're working with an IndexedDB, you can select that IndexedDB and select Delete Database. That's it. And in fact, once we do the syncing system, you'll be able to delete that database, refresh, and the application will recreate it on its own. So if you're interested in more local first content, let me know. I'm doing a ton of this stuff, from full stack local first platforms to writing your own to the fullest extent, to just working on offline only like we did here. I think this is a really awesome way to write software, and you now have an application that is private, offline, works lightning fast every single time, and will work under any network conditions. As always, this is Scott from Syntax. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, let me know. Leave a comment below everything you thought about this video, this content, and more. Happy to hear from you, and I can't wait to create more local first content for you. And if you want to see this in any other language, for instance, interpolating this to React might be a little bit too hard, I can go ahead and work on this exact same tutorial in a full React system if you would like as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.